public disclosure for a price, why the San Diego Sheriff's Department wanted 6 figures to release misconduct records. Some state DMV laws help undocumented immigrants come out of the shadows, but they might be helping ICE make arrests across California. And the local test case for Native Americans getting into the marijuana business. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, reporter Maya Srikrishnan, a voice of San Diego, Matt Hall, editorial and opinion director at the San Diego Union Tribune, KPBS reporter Claire Tregeser, and reporter J. Harry Jones of the Union Tribune. Well, a new law taking effect January 1st was designed to turn California from secretive to transparent when it comes to police records. But that hasn't happened so far. KPBS made national news when its request to the San Diego County Sheriff for records on police shootings prompted a bill for more than $350,000. And Claire, start there. What did KPBS ask for, and did your hand tremble when you wrote that check to them?
Yeah. We weren't quite prepared to hand over that amount of money. This was part of a request that we made to all local law enforcement agencies, and we just asked for everything that the law now allows us to ask for, which is records of officers who were investigated for use of force, including killing someone in the line of duty, and then a sustained finding of sexual assault or lying during an investigation. So that's what we asked for back over the past 5 years. Okay, so sounds like a pretty straightforward journalistic request. Right. And how does how do agencies like the Sheriff Department, how do they justify this? 6 figures, then some. Well, what they said is that it would take a lot of time. They had a lot of video and audio related to those investigations, and so they would need to review that, and that would cost a lot of money. They sent us an itemized list and add it all up to $350,000. Wow. And Matt, you weren't terribly thrilled with this because the Union Tribune and other news organizations were doing the same thing, and you're literally writing an editorial blasting Sheriff Gore when he changed his mind. What happened in that?
I'm a persuasive guy. What can I tell you? No, look, this was an outrage. It was shameful, full stop. I called him and I said, we're going to do an editorial tomorrow that lays it all out there. It says this is ridiculous. These are public records, and you guys are in law enforcement. You know what law enforcement should do? Follow the law. We talked for 30 minutes, and he said, yeah, you raised some good points, Matt, but we'll review this next week. So I said, fine, I'm going to write my editorial. Started writing it. He called me back to say, we're definitely going to review this next week. And I said, I'm still writing the editorial because you haven't really moved the needle at all. He called me back a third time and said, okay, we're definitely going to review it, and we're probably going to reconsider it, but I got to talk to my staff first. I was like, you know what, your staff reads the Union Tribune too. Why don't you just tell me that you're going to waive these fees because it's the right thing to do, and I'll write that instead. He said that, and that's what we did. Okay. Now, Claire, go back to that new law itself. What does it call for regarding public release of these police records? Well, yeah, like I said, what it's meant to call for is any officer who has been investigated for use of force, including killing someone in the line of duty, and then it's a little bit different, a sustained finding of sexual assault or lying during the course of an investigation. And it's, meant to take California. Previously it had one of the least transparent laws in the country to be able to let people see what investigations had happened into officers. And I mean, I think that Matt covered this a little bit in his editorial, but when you get a cost like $350,000, that's not really going to be possible for any news organization. No, especially these days, yeah. Even when we brought it down to, okay, forget the video, forget the audio, let's just do paper records, it was still going to be upwards of $3,000, I think, which maybe we could, fit in the budget, but we were starting to talk about, is that going to be possible? How can we do that? So, I think included in the law, it really needs to be that these need to be provided for free. And that's a key point, because the sheriff came back to me in our first phone conversation, said, we're not withholding these records, Matt. And I was like, come on, you are. It's by default. Yeah, the cost is so onerous. The cost is so prohibitive that maybe the Union Tribune or KPBS or someone with a well-paid lawyer could fight you on that. But what about the rest of the journalists who can't do that, about freelancers. You know,
the spirit of
the public. It's the spirit.
Right.
It's the spirit of the law.
And Jay, I want to bring you in my end of the conversation. You've been a reporter here a long time. You've dealt with police agencies for a long, long time. This law needed, in your estimation? Was California pretty darn secretive when it came to public records on police?
Oh, incredibly so. What I was curious, does this apply only to officers that no longer have a job, or can they still be active?
No, I think it's anyone, even people who are still employed by their departments.
Oh, I remember when CLRB, the Citizens Law Enforcement Review Board, was formed way back when, and the unions fought it, and they were stripped, never given subpoena power, and it basically made him a toothless tiger. And ever since then, I don't know who pays attention to CLRB, because they didn't really do anything. And
so always tough for reporters to get that, and the unions
impossible, really
have been tough. And you've run into the same sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Voice San Diego has had to intervene in cases before to try and get footage when someone was killed by a law enforcement officer and things like that. It's really difficult, and I think that when you're talking about agencies that are funded by taxpayers, when one of their people take a life or sexually assault someone or, you know, lie during an investigation, those are things that the public should be able to have access to.
Right. Now, Matt, there's an issue here about timing. The police unions are still battling this, and we'll get to some of that in a second. But the argument is that they didn't mean to go, the law wasn't meant to go back. But the sponsor of the law, Senator Nancy Skinner of Berkeley, a Democrat from Berkeley, says she absolutely meant to go back in time, not simply to the start of this law.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there's a question about whether January 1st is a cutoff date or whether it should apply retroactively, and of course it should apply retroactively.
I mean, this is a little bit separate from that, because several local police unions, including San Diego, are suing their own cities, saying you should not be releasing these records because it's not clear in the law that it applies to past investigations, that it would only apply to investigations going forward. The author of the law says, of course I meant it to apply to past investigations, but the sheriff's union is not part of that lawsuit. So it's, you know, kind of two different things going on at the same time, where there's this lawsuit saying don't release the records at all. The sheriff's department wasn't part of that, so they would have to release the records. They put this high price tag on it, but now they've waived that. And so now the sheriff's department is beginning slowly to publish some of their records online. They already have 2 cases online.
Did the sheriff's department indicate that they're going to publish everything online, or are they selecting what they decide to publish?
I think that, yeah, what they sent in a letter to us is that, you know, they said it's going to take them a long time because they still have to review all of these internal investigations and, you know, redact anything that's not, in their opinion, part of what the law calls for them to disclose. I mean, they do, in the first 2 cases, they're redacting the victims' names, personal information, which needs to be done. And so then they're saying once they're done with each case, they will put it all online instead of sending it out to the news organizations who've requested it.
Is it emerging now that this law was maybe poorly drafted, or just wasn't as thorough?
Sacramento didn't fully think through a law. We're going to talk about marijuana later, spoiler alert, and Prop 64. You could drive a truck through some of the holes in that law. Yeah, I mean, I think, because we actually asked Skinner's office, did this come up proactively, or did you just assume because it wasn't brought up that it would apply? And unfortunately, you know, and that's partly on us too, we didn't think to ask the question at the time. You know, and I haven't seen any news reports that brought it up to say, yes, it should apply. But in the absence of that, of course it should be retroactive. There's plenty of, I think, case law, and eventually a judge will have to settle this.
Well, in LA, a judge has already decided and said, yes, it applies retroactively, but they're appealing that. So I imagine if that's what happens here, you know, all of these things are kind of playing out in individual locations, in individual counties. I would imagine that we're headed towards a higher court ruling on all of this.
Yeah, so right now it's just kind of piecemeal, and the agencies still have a lot of discretion in what they're releasing as a practical matter, and if they're charging or not charging, and it's kind of per request and per agency at this point, it would seem.
Right, and some are involved in this lawsuit, some aren't. So we've gotten a few, you know, the Chula Vista Police Department released 1 report. They said that's all they had. Coronado said they don't have any reports, and same with Carlsbad. Or they didn't say they didn't have any reports, they just said we aren't giving you anything. They wouldn't specify whether that meant they didn't think that they needed to or they actually didn't have anything. So it's all, kind of playing out in each individual location.
So it seems like the courts are going to have to step in because of a bit of a mess. So maybe the Supreme Court ultimately will have some sort of ruling.
It seems like we'll figure it out over time. But in the meantime, props to the Sheriff's Department for at least releasing redacted efforts, because to your point
So far,
exactly, other agencies aren't releasing any at all, and so that's doubly bad.
Right. Well, certainly keep an eye on that one and be following up with that. We're going to move on. California passed a law in 2017 restricting law enforcement agencies in the state from participating in federal immigration enforcement. But Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents are finding ways around that law. They're gaining access to DMV records to locate and arrest undocumented immigrants, more than 1 million of whom have obtained California driver's licenses in the past 5 years. And so, Maya, start there with the law. Why are ICE agents generally barred from getting DMV records?
Well, so since SB 54, the California Values Act, passed, the state has been trying to create sort of a firewall between local law enforcement and local agencies and immigration enforcement. And in general, I mean, ICE isn't really barred from using the DMV records. They're supposed to be able to use it for things related to people with criminal histories. But what I found was that it's really hard with these databases to determine each individual inquiry whether they were actually using it for a person with criminal history, and it's not necessarily something that the state is tracking. And I came across a few incidences where there were unauthorized immigrants who appeared to have been found by ICE, their address or the vehicle registration, and they had no criminal history in the U.S.
Right, so you're talking about any kind of serious crime we're talking about here. Obviously, being here without documentation, coming over the border illegally is a crime in itself, but it have to be something else. We're looking for some sort of history of crime aside from just simply being here. Yeah,
well, and I mean, immigration crimes are civil crimes, so, they're talking about criminal, which is a whole different it's a whole different system. Right.
And the 2013 law, that was signed by former Governor Jerry Brown, allowed undocumented immigrants to get licenses. It remains controversial. Give us a little background on that. What was the purpose of that? And as I said in the open, a lot of people have taken advantage and gotten that license.
Well, the law was meant to bring unauthorized immigrants out of the shadow. It was supposed to kind of cut down on things like hit and runs and things like that.
Right, so you're here without documentation, suddenly you're in an accident, you're going to take off. You just, because the consequences are deportation, et cetera. So that was the idea behind the whole thing.
Yes.
But it remains controversial, does it not?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who still think that people who are unauthorized shouldn't, have access to a driver's license or things like that. And then, even organizations that are generally supportive of efforts to bring immigrants out of the shadows were concerned because, this basically meant that a lot of personal information about unauthorized immigrants who were potentially hiding from immigration officials and trying to stay under the radar would be put into these databases that are linked up to federal law enforcement and to law enforcement in other states and things like that.
Now, has this changed? Is this a change with the new administration, with the Trump administration? Were we seeing this a few years ago with President Obama when he was in office? Because, as we noted several times on this show, there were a record number of folks deported during the 8 years of Obama. Or is this a crackdown that ICE is doing and using these DMV records this way now?
I mean, I think that ICE agents have probably always used the databases available to them, just like all law enforcement, to try and find people. I mean, one of the big differences between the Obama administration and the Trump administration is that the Obama administration really focused its interior immigration enforcement on people who have criminal records within the U.S. And now we're starting to see higher numbers of people who have no criminal history in the U.S. other than the fact that they are here illegally.
I wanted to ask, you had some, anecdotes of people in your story. Do you have a sense of why ICE was targeting them in particular?
No, this was kind of, that was the strange thing. For all the 3 individuals who cases I was able to dig into, none of them had criminal histories in the U.S., and they also didn't have prior deportations. They had things called voluntary returns, which is they tend to happen only with Mexican nationals near the border, where they get sent back and you don't have the same punishments as you do with deportation. So with deportations, you are usually barred from coming back into the country legally for 10 years, and they didn't face that. Some of them had been in the country for, like a decade. They were working. So it was kind of unclear why those specific people were targeted, but it was clear in the arrest reports that they were targeted. They had identified them and they were staking out their apartment. They were looking for their vehicles. One of them, they were looking for him for over a year.
And do you know what has happened to them since they were arrested?
They're all still in the United States. They're all in deportation proceedings. So they are trying to fight their deportation orders and potentially try and get legal status in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what does ICE have to say about this? And you confronted them as you did your reporting.
Well, so ICE and the DMV basically told me that they don't have access to like a list of people who would have these licenses who are unauthorized, nor can they kind of just do like a blanket search in these databases for people. When I asked them if they have a name of someone for another reason and they go into a database and search for them, would they use the DMV databases? They basically told me that how law enforcement conducts its investigations is sensitive information, and they couldn't give me any further information.
Okay, but they're saying that we're really not doing this as a blanket rule now, but you found several cases where it appeared to be the way.
Yeah, and I mean, when I talked to the DMV, it was pretty clear that there are ways that law enforcement can still access this information. And they're only supposed to be using it for people with criminal history, but again, it doesn't appear that there's a mechanism in place to ensure that every individual inquiry actually is following those guidelines.
Okay, and there was a report issued in December showing how DMV records are shared with federal immigration agencies. Give us the background about that report.
So the ACLU of Northern California and the National Immigrant Law Center had been tracking this for a couple of years, and they had basically tried to figure out through a series of Public Records Act requests how ICE could be interacting with these databases, and they got a pretty good overview of the ways that ICE can still access them.
And what's being done now? A couple seconds left in this segment. Are some state leaders looking at loopholes and seeing what might be done to change this?
Well, Assemblywoman Lorna Gonzalez said that she is looking into what has been happening, and she's in talks with the Attorney General and the Governor's office to see what can be done.
So we'll see what happens in following up on that one. All right, good story. Well, we're going to move on. Their casino operation went bust a few years ago. Now a small Native American tribe is betting they can recoup losses by selling marijuana at the remote backcountry site, even though the county of San Diego has banned pot sales. And Jay, this is an intriguing story. Start by telling us about this tribe and where's their cannabis dispensary located?
Well, their dispensary is what used to be the very front of the casino. And to get there, you have to drive up a mile-long drive, just like you did for the casino, but give your driver's license to a guard who scans it. By the time you get into the dispensary, they've already on their iPads have all your information, and they're all very helpful. They're very nice people, and you can buy edibles and creams and many varieties of pot, most of which are grown on, all of which are grown on the property. They got about 3 acres of greenhouses now. They've got room for about 8 acres. They also have a testing laboratory, and they say the stuff is as good or better than anything you'll find anywhere else in the state.
Yeah, well, I want to get to that in a second. Now, this is a remote area, right? It's Santa Isabel is kind of way out in the back northeast county, right?
Yeah, it's over by where Highway 76 and Highway 79 intersect, over by Lake Henshaw. And that location is why their casino, which opened in 2007, right before the recession, just never made it. It's just there are too many other options for people from the populated areas that they would be literally driving by other casinos. And theirs was small, it was very nice, and was popular with the locals, but the locals weren't nearly.
Not enough folks back there to make it a go.
They think they can, that their location is tough because you can go to San Diego and buy this stuff immediately. Right. But they say because they're a sovereign nation, and the state won't recognize them yet. They're trying to get into the medical marijuana market. That's another issue. But 18% tax is what the state takes from Prop 64. They don't charge that, and they have no transportation costs because everything is right next door. So they say basically half price is what per gram cost. I don't know if that's really what it turns out to be, but
So it's not location, it's price in their instance. So no tax charged and low overhead because the distribution is right there, so transportation isn't a problem. Right. So let's go back a little bit. The voters approved the recreational use of cannabis in 2016, as you said, Prop 64. But jurisdictions like San Diego have to opt in. Most jurisdictions don't. Right. But they're in a different category, right? Explain that to us.
Right. The Board of Supervisors said no dispensaries, and they're right in the middle of the unincorporated territory.
Right. So if they were a little community there, any other community, they would be banned because of the county supervisors.
People are upset about that. They thought this was like a loophole.
Right.
And they're worried about more tribes doing it.
But they're a sovereign nation because
they're a sovereign nation. The state says you can come in to the whole regular. See, Prop 64 didn't have any provisions about tribes. It just didn't. They ignored it completely. They've been lobbying. They formed a group of 23 tribes that are trying to lobby Sacramento and the governor's office. The last thing the governor's office said was, you just let us take control and we'll treat you like every other dispensary and you give us 18% tax. And that was a non-starter for them because they would give up their sovereignty and they don't want to do that.
Right. Right. That's a big lever for them. Why give up that sovereignty? Yeah.
Right. They had been in the marijuana business for about 3 years. They had started renting inside their casino and some greenhouses to private companies to grow medical marijuana, and they had
before the recreational law
before the recreation coming in. And then last year they changed their inner regulations to allow sales.
Yeah. And there's a California Bureau of Cannabis Control, and that's aligned with the state, and they're kind of saying the same thing. We want to treat you like all the other dispensaries, right?
Yeah. Well, the state says they can do what they want on the tribal land as long as they only are selling stuff that they grow there. They can't take their product and try to sell it anywhere else.
Okay.
And that's what they're trying to do.
Claire? I know you said this was the first in the San Diego region. Do you know of other parts of the state where this is happening?
There are some dispensaries. It's a few other tribes. They were a little unclear about that, and I'm not sure. What's interesting is this group of 23 tribes throughout the state called the California Native American Cannabis Association. The head of the regulatory agency said Isabel wouldn't tell me what other local tribes wanted to do this. But he did say, you probably go to that website and you can find out. And there were 4 other tribes that are part of this and he did say that they're
in this area.
In this area. Yeah. Most of them are rural. Manzanita, Campo, Los Coyotes, the most inaccessible one of them all. But then interestingly, Sequan, which is about to open a $300 million resort.
With tremendous marketing and tremendous advertising for their casino.
And I haven't been able to get from them what their plans are, and I don't think they would tell me until they're ready to announce anything. But that's a fascinating, I don't know.
Very interesting. And of course, they'll rely on the sovereign nation status as well as the other.
Unless they can get the law changed, because they would all rather get somehow. Other states have allowed the taxes to be collected but then redistributed to the tribes in states that allow marijuana. So, thinking about it right now, that's the state saying no.
Now, your story notes that some of the neighbors aren't real happy about this. And
there were a whole group of people who went and testified before the Planning Commission and the supervisors against allowing marijuana because, for the same reasons, obviously, we're corrupting our kids, when people were stoned driving on these back roads, that kind of thing. And now they all just feel like cheated and frustrated because all of a sudden here's this one, what if we start getting dispensaries at every Indian reservation, which dot the backcountry landscape, but many tribes.
But you noted, and you quoted some folks from the tribes, they're trying to be good neighbors and all, but
absolutely.
But they've got a business here that they want to try and exploit.
Right. And they say theirs is the safest dispensary in the county because you don't have somebody breaking in or waiting to rob it. I mean, it's the most secure facility you could ever find. There are no neighbors to complain because there are no neighbors. I mean, they're in the middle of nowhere. They've never had a call for police in any way regarding this stuff. In fact, they've called the police to get illegal grows that they've found in the past years being done by gangs out of Central California. So they've had no issues, and they were concerned, but they definitely want to sell pot. So
have there been any car accidents uptick, or do they monitor that? Because that's one of the big complaints, right? About
it's just started a month ago, and not many people know that it exists. They haven't really started marketing yet. They wanted to make sure everything was set. So it'd be too early to tell on that kind of. You can't smoke it on the property. You have to take it home or get off the property before you can do anything.
And of course, with all recreational marijuana, driving under the influence laws apply to anybody, regardless of where you buy it and where you're using it. Let's talk about a minute. We got about a minute to go in this segment. Let's talk about the supervisors. Are they trying to do something about that? What's their reaction been to this county supervisor?
I talked to Diane Jacob, and she she said she wasn't even sure this was legal. They were going to have their counsel look at it. She hadn't known about the dispensary until that week that I called her. It sure sounds like what they're doing is legal at this point, but they're going to be looking at it, and they don't like it. She doesn't like it.
Yeah, no, they want to do a preemptive strike if Sequana and some of the other tribes are going to get into this?
I mean, we don't know what they're planning. Whether,
Cut back on, because we're already making less in taxes on recreational marijuana than we expected. So if more tribes are going to get into this, seems
That's
like
a good point. Yeah, they expected $1 billion at first blush, and they got 350 odd million.
Right, and there was a story this week saying that the black market is still there. The culture has been there to kind of buy under the table, and that's hard to turn around. So another, we're just about out of time, but that's another fascinating angle to this whole thing as we move into the recreational cannabis industry in California and the use throughout. Well, it's a good story. We'll see what happens on the follow-up there. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Maya Sri Krishnan of the Voice of San Diego, Matt Hall of the San Diego Union Tribune, Claire Tregerser of KPBS News, and J. Harry Jones of the Union Tribune. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable, and join us again next Friday.